So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming and giving me a chance to show you how I paint, how I approach watercolor, the different techniques involved in creating a work of art. So today we're going to learn about how to paint a floral with my system of painting. So I brought a reference photo that I'm going to work off of, and I did a small linear drawing on the sheet of watercolor paper, which is Arches 140 cold press. And before I start, I am going to put out fresh color. So I'm going to use two pigments in the background. And those two pigments are going to be Winsor & Newton, Aureolin yellow, and cobalt turquoise light. So before I paint any wash in watercolor, I always use fresh paint. So you can put out a pea-size amount of your watercolor, your pigment, because the fresher the paint, the more brilliant the wash. It's like cooking. If you want a really great meal, you use fresh ingredients. Canned ingredients or paint that's already on your palette is a little stale. So my method of painting relies on painting background to foreground in order to isolate the various points of interest. And you'll understand this as we go along in the painting. So right now, I'm going to wet parts of the background, put in a fluid veil of water. You're going to go around the outline, the parameter of the iris drawing, and get the whole side of the paper wet. Pretty saturated with water. Clean water, by the way. I'm using a number 14 brush, round brush. And I'm going around the leaf elements. And I've split the paper in half, so we're going to do this side first. So once we get this saturated, we're going to come over and do this side and leave a little area in the middle so they don't combine just yet. Now, it's always a good idea whenever you're painting to have your palette and water and tools on the side of the table for the hand that you are. In other words, if you're left-handed, your equipment is on the left-hand side of the paper, vice versa for the right side. It keeps it accessible, and then also you don't drip paint on your paper unnecessarily as you move along in the painting. All right, so you've got this whole background wet. And now you're going to charge it with this beautiful turquoise light. Now we're going to gradate the wash from darker value to lighter value to weight the bottom of the painting, just like in the reference photo. It's darker here and it's lighter at the top of the page. So I always paint in middle value, meaning it's not too dark and it's not too light. We can add darks and you can subtract some of the lights, but you want to just work in a medium value paint initially. I always paint flat, and I allow the wash to puddle and flow organically. which is what makes my watercolors so interesting. I'm allowing watercolor to be watery. So we're going to get a little fainter, a little lighter at the top. And then a little more pigment. Now we add a very intense blue at the bottom. See the difference in value? And allow it to filter up through the fluid wash. Now we'll let this sit for a minute, and we're going to start this side of the page. Once again, we're going to work in middle value, not this dark color. We're going to weight the paper down a little bit. As the paper begins to dry, as the water evaporates, the paper starts to bend and ripple because it is an organic surface. It's actually like a piece of fabric. So it begins to warp and ripple, and to control the bending, I use small weights to keep it a little flatter. I never tape the paper, and I never staple it down because that forces the drying in awkward ways. I want it to be more natural. So you have covered the surface of the whole page, of the whole background in the turquoise blue. And now we're going to infuse a little deeper value. To anchor this corner. And control the wash. Now this puddle is pretty ripe to dry, but I'm going to do one more application of paint, so I'm going to soak up some of the moisture with a thirsty brush. A thirsty brush is a wet brush with the moisture coaxed out, and then you soak up that puddle carefully. Now, to make this background a little more interesting, we're going to add a complementary color, the aureolin, the yellow. So we're going to create a glow behind this iris blossom so that it brings out the backlighting of the image. So at this point, the wash is very wet. It's not dried at all. And now we're going to take the aureolin in a smaller size brush. This is probably a number 8. And we're going to drop in to this wet blue wash the glow, the backlighting to this flower. All right. So it's very wet and very moist and drying on its own accord, meaning in natural atmospheric conditions. And before I proceed to the next stage, this has to be totally dry because you want the value to be established before moving ahead in the painting. And a wet watercolor wash always looks 2 values darker than it really is. In other words, when this dries, it's going to look lighter than what you've painted. So you have to learn to paint a little deeper and a little richer than you want it to turn out, because when this is dry, it's going to soften and lighten in depth. So at this point, I'm going to let this wash dry, and then we'll resume the next passage of painting. Now the background wash has totally dried. It is not at all moist, and it's dry to the touch, and it's ready to move forward. Or we're ready to move forward. So the next thing you have to figure out in painting the way I paint is, what is the next background object to paint in the painting to bring the whole thing forward illusionistically? And in my mind, the thing that I want to come out and be presentational is the blossom of the iris. So the next thing that I'm going to paint in are the leaves and the stems, because they need to recede in the picture plane so that the blossom comes forward, and then the blossom is anchored on these structural leaves. So I'm going to put out 2 more new colors, burnt sienna, Winsor Newton burnt sienna, and Winsor green yellow shade. Always put out fresh color every time. We're going to wet the leaves from top to bottom, like we did the background wash. Keeping them fluid and simple. So we're putting clear water on each of the leaf pods. Keeping it very moist. And now with our smaller brush, which is a number 4, we're going to outline the leaf shape. In burnt sienna. And then float in some aureolin. And drop in a tiny bit of Winsor green. And we're going to do the same thing down here. First we outline in burnt sienna. Float in a little aureolin. and then drop in some Windsor green. And I'm going to move from right to left, doing the same approach. So we outlined in burnt sienna with our small number 4 brush, and now we're introducing aureolin into the wash, into the cell of the watercolor. I'm a cell painter, which means I paint a cell, make it what I want, and move on to the next cell. So here goes. Aureolin. And then a little Winsor Newton to anchor the leaf and the stem. Going to put a little weight here. Keep the paper flat. Over here, outline in burnt sienna. Float in a little aureolin. And then deepen the wash with a little Winsor green. Now, just to make this area more related to the background before the wash has dried, I'm going to drop in a little cobalt turquoise light to integrate it more closely to the background wash. So it doesn't really change the greenness of it, but it gives it a depth and a richness that relates to the background. So now that you have all the leaves and stems painted, you need to let this stage dry completely before moving on to the flower. So I'm going to allow this to dry, and then resume the next passage in a few minutes. Now, our stems and leaves have dried, thoroughly dried, and we're going to do one intermediate step before we move on to the next passage of painting. And that step is taking a smaller number 6 brush and softening this edge as it moves into the flora, the flower. So we're going to soften this edge and this edge, this edge. Basically what you're doing is you're getting rid of this little bead of value, this minuscule, pretty unobvious, pretty discrete little linear element of paint. It's almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but as a watercolor artist, you need to take away that line so it becomes a space of color. So the next thing to figure out in painting this beautiful blossom is which area is farthest in the background so that the leaves and the petals in the foreground continue to move forward in the picture plane. So it's going to be this one, this shape, and this shape. So once again, we wet our cell of the shape under this petal. And this area right here. We're going to use aureolin, a little fresh color. And we're going to introduce a new pigment, Daniel Smith Shadow Violet. So we'll start over here. We're going to outline this shape, this petal, in a little burnt sienna. Drop in some aureolin. And then add a small amount of the shadow violet. And over here, on this petal, this background petal, we're just going to add a small veil of aureolin. And a teeny amount of shadow violet. And then up here, we'll add the aureolin. Keeping it very light in value, very soft. And a small amount of shadow violet. We're going to weight the paper down. So you see how the petals in the foreground are beginning to come forward now that the petals on the opposite side of the blossom have been painted in. It is pushing these petals out of the picture plane. While we have time, we're going to do this petal and this petal, background petal, because these are not going to interfere because they're wet. We'll add this veil of water. And this veil of water. We're going to have one more new color, French ultramarine blue. And we'll start with outlining this wash in blue. And then drop in a little aureolin. And then moving along to this wash, same thing. We're going to outline in the French ultramarine blue. And then extend the blue a little farther, and then drop in a little aureolin. So we'll let this dry, and then we'll resume painting the rest of the flower in a few minutes. Watercolor is a hurry up to wait process. You have about 20 minutes to manipulate a wet wash, and then you have to wait till it's totally dry before you proceed. So half the time in the studio, I'm waiting for paint to dry. All right, so now these background petals have dried completely to the touch. I'm waving my hand over the paper to show you that it's totally dry. After they were dried, I took my brush and softened the edge around each one of the washes here so that the foreground petal will really step forward from the background petal. So we're going to do a few of the last of the interior petals, this area here and this cell here. And we first start our wash by wetting the surface of the paper to loosen up the fiber to accept the paint. Clean our palette. I always use fresh color, as I've said before. When pigment is exposed to air and water, it begins to break down its chemistry. And the minute the chemistry starts breaking down, it becomes duller and has less value and less brilliance. So you don't ever want to use paint on the palette. You want to start with fresh color always. So we're going to do this petal in just French ultramarine blue, middle value. Using clean water. I'm a big fan of very clean, fresh, sparkling water. The cleaner the water, the cleaner your wash. When I work in the studio, I have 10 buckets of water available at all times when I paint. And we'll do this area here. Outlining a bit in French ultramarine blue. And we'll drop in a small amount of aureolin on this petal. And we'll do this small area here. And let this much dry. But because they're smaller areas and not that invasive in terms of the rest of the painting, we're going to go ahead and add this petal here. So we wet it with clean water. Get it very moist. And now we want to introduce one final pigment, Mineral Violet by Holbein. I'm going to outline that cell of water with French ultramarine. take our mineral violet and add a rich layer of paint. Now I'm following some of the natural curves of the petal from the reference photo. To mimic the natural form of the flower. Keeping very careful not to get into too much of the wet wash from behind. All right. Now, let this dry and then have opportunity to address the rest of the blossom. Welcome back. So our petal is totally dry now, and I want you to notice how it's darker and richer and deeper in value than every other petal that I've already painted. So be sure when you're working on this petal that you put on the paint in a more concentrated form so that it's this value, this rich. So we're going to do small, tiny washes underneath the beard of the iris, right here. These are inconsequential washes, but they add to the structure of the painting. So I'm using a tiny brush, and I'm going around the beard of this iris. And what it does is it pops out the tongue of this petal shape behind. We're going to do a little curve of the petal here in French ultramarine blue. Outline a little darker. and add a little aureolin tucked in the corner. Now we're going to turn our attention to this petal here because this petal is behind this frontal petal. So this one goes in first, and then we'll focus on that one. So we'll take our brush, clean water, and wet this curvy shape. Get it nice and even and nice and saturated. The wetter you do the veil of water, the longer you have to manipulate the wash. If you put the water on too thinly, it'll dry too quickly and it eliminates your painting time to sophisticate the cell. So you want to get it nice and wet and allow it to creep into the middle of the paper, the depth of the paper. We're going to take our smaller brush, put out some more French ultramarine. And we're going to outline in French ultramarine. Take our bigger number 8 brush and extend that veil of color. I'm going to twist and curve this petal a little more three-dimensionally by observing what it's doing in nature. And now we'll drop in just a wee bit more intense pigment. All right. Now, we'll let that dry, but because it's not interfering or interacting with this other wash, this other petal here, we'll go ahead and do that while this is drying. We'll take our clean brush and clean water and infuse the shape with the water. Open up the fiber of paper. And then outline in French ultramarine. Take our bigger brush and extend the blue into the field of water. Add some mineral violet to the blue and weight it at the corner and bottom part of the petal. Now, mineral violet is a very dark and gray violet, and it's almost too cool for me, so I like to warm it up a bit with Holbein bright violet, which is a little redder and rosier at the top of the wash. See the difference? It's almost pink. So the warmer violet will integrate with the cooler violet and give you an interesting two-tone petal. Couple more. Snips of deep, intense French ultramarine on the perimeter of the wash, and then we'll let it dry. Okay, so I'll let this dry and then we'll start the rest of the painting. So back again, we're going to do the middle interior petal in a very light blue. And then we'll drop down and do the major tongue of the iris, which is the focus of the painting. So let's wet in this area. And then while that is soaking into the fiber of the paper, we're going to do a small, very soft division of this tongue in a light French ultramarine blue. This divides the tongue into two pieces. This will eventually disappear once the whole tongue is painted. So up here, we're going to switch gears and work this tongue in the background colors. So it relates once again to everything that's behind the flower. So we're going to outline in cobalt turquoise light. Drop in a little aureolin to extend the blue. We'll tweak it with a little French ultramarine at the tip of the petal. Let that dry. All right, so the top petal has been modified and molded into the three-dimensional shape, weighting the right of the petal in more cobalt turquoise and rounding it out to the lighter side of the aureolin. And it is drying, but because it's not in the way of the giant tongue that we're about to work on, we can go ahead and begin working on that frontal tongue of the iris. So we'll take our brush and animate the paper with fresh, clean water to the right side of the tongue. We're going to paint the tongue in two shapes, but we'll link them together at the very end, so it becomes one soft petal of flower. But because I don't want to do the whole shape at once, I'm breaking it up into two passages. So keep this dry blue line that we painted in dry. Do not put your veil of water on top of that blue line, just right next to it. We're going to outline in mineral violet violet on the right hand. We're going to start with the right hand side, down the middle, and over to the parameter. Take our French ultramarine and float in the base color to extend the outline into the shape. Now we want to weight the tongue from light to dark. So we'll keep it softer and more fluid at the top of the wash. See how I'm creating more depth and value on the bottom of the petal? Now we'll introduce some bright violet to warm up the petal from the cool violet. And then begin working on the passage to the left. So we outline in French ultramarine. Remember not to go over that slight, dry blue line yet. Keep them separate. Intermix a little mineral violet. So I'm touching at the top of the petal with a little clean water to give it more volume and freshness that will filter down to the bottom of the petal. Now I'm going to charge one more time the bottom lip of the petal with deeper, more intense pigment. Now, right when you think you have both sides of this tongue painted in an interesting way, gradating from light to dark, warm to cool, in the three colors, mineral violet, bright violet, and French ultramarine, you take the opportunity, when you've gotten them both painted exactly with the nuances that you want, you take your very small brush before the wash is dried, and you link together the two shapes. First, before we do that, we're going to drop in a tiny amount of yellow. On the center of the tongue. And then we link that together over the blue line that kept them separate. And then we combine them at the bottom, down here. So the two shapes become one area of imagery. Painted separately, but now are one. And we'll let this dry before doing the final touches on the rest of the flower. All right, back again. Our final giant tongue in the front of the flower is totally painted, dried, linked together, and ready for the little beard, the last portion of the painting, to be painted in. So the beard is going to be white, light value, and spiky on the top. So we wet it with water. Add a little yellow. And with our tiny brush, a little bright violet on the spikes. And that is the last portion of painting this beautiful blue iris in the way that I paint. So when you're painting, always remember that when you're working, keep your water clean, your paint fresh, your materials in order. And it all goes into a statement that is brief and beautiful and bright. But above all else, remember that you're not painting a flower. You're painting paint on paper. So don't make your flower correct. Make your flower beautiful. Because in the end, it's never going to be the iris. It's always just paint on paper. So I say, give me a beautiful wash that might be the iris. Don't give me the iris.